If you're new to product management, or the whole concept of agile seems confusing for you, or maybe you've had people talk about user stories, epics, acceptance criteria, sprint, scrum, all these things seems very confusing for you, well, you are in the right place. What I am here to do is to help you understand this concept better. Maybe if you know how they started, why we started doing these practices, and what they are here to solve, just maybe you can get better at using these tools that are made available for you to actually perform good actions within your organization. Okay. Sorry, in the old ways, before the advent of Agile, before we started talking about sprint, before we started talking about epics and user stories, tasks were usually long technical requirements that oftentimes take hard to break down. The focus usually is on features. Let's turn out this feature, let's roll out that feature. Whereas most of these features actually don't solve user needs. And a lot of times it becomes very hard to prioritize what to do first or what to do after. Why? Because a lot of time, because the documentation is bulky, it takes time for developers, designers, or your stakeholders to actually easily understand what you're doing. But now, with the advent of user story, acceptance criteria, and all other tools that Agile brings for us, there is a fast feedback cycle. Like, you are able to get feedback easily. You could understand, for people that have knowledge about the previous models, like waterfall model, where you have to finish a stage before moving to the other stage. You could understand why you have to finish a stage before moving to the other stage. But now, with Agile, because there's a faster cycle, you don't necessarily have to finish a stage before the other. Once a particular part of the user needs is understood, the process can actually continue to the next phase, and thereby keeping every person in the team involved in the delivery process. So what exactly are user stories? What are user stories? Why is there so much fuse about them? And what can we really learn from them? How can we use them? So as I said, user stories, they are naturally small but focused documentation. So you could say, as opposed to having like a 5-page documentation or 10-page documentation, you can have a single statement that actually captures the user needs. And usually the format is simple. The format is usually, who is the user? Then what exactly does the user want to be able to do? And then what benefit does this thing that the user have to do, what does it make for them? Sometimes the benefit could be to the organization. But the point of every user story is to know who the user is, what they want, and how what they want would actually solve their needs. So what are the major components? When you are thinking of writing a user story, you have to focus on what will benefit the user. The whole idea of writing smaller chunks of data or statements that can be easily transformed is to ensure that we actually meet the customer need, not to meet your oga's need or your boss needs or I don't know what else kind of need that people meet these days, but to meet the customer need, to be sure that this is exactly what the customer need. Well, all user stories don't come alone. They come with acceptance criteria. And acceptance criteria are what points to more like you saying that this is how we validate that a user story is actually completed or the user need has been met. I know some of you are like, acceptance criteria again? Yes, of course. Acceptance criteria is basically, in simple terms, how do we confirm that this user story has been met? After we are done writing the codes, designing, how do we say that this particular user need is met? That is what we call acceptance criteria. So don't worry about the big grammar. Now, what exactly is acceptance criteria? There are two major types of acceptance criteria. There's one, scenario based, and that's why if you see some acceptance criteria, some user stories, for those of us that are conversant with it, you will see words like, given that this is done, this should be done, or given that this is done, if I do this, this should do. For example, you could say that given that I have signed up on X website. I should have access to do this, and when I do this, this should happen. These are scenario-based acceptance criteria. But personally, I don't do scenario-based because they make sometimes they defeat the purpose of the acceptance criteria because they get very bulky, especially if a user story could actually solve multiple scenarios. So the second type of acceptance criteria that you could write is the rule-oriented one. You would often find as well that some people would say, confirm that A is equals to B. Confirm that when I do this, I get this. Confirm that when I do this, I get this. So in that way, it is actually straightforward, easily shortened, and easy to read for anybody working on the user stories. I hope you understand that. Well, if you don't, please in the comment section, ask your questions. I'm available to answer them. All right, let's talk about epics. Epics generally, honestly, epics generally can be a pain. It can be a pain. A lot of times I've met product managers that will tell me, my boss told me what I've written is an epic, not a user story. Or somebody comes and say, my user story is an epic. I don't know how to sort this balance. Well, this is just the simple truth. User stories have to be specific. They have to meet a specific human needs or user needs, so to say. Not necessarily human, because your user might actually be a robot or in the AI generation, by the way. Anyway, the point is, user stories has to meet a user need. Whoever will be using your system, your user could be anything. Now, if your user needs to particularly do something, then it's a user story. But now, when you talk about epics, epics are more broader in scope. They are more larger in scope. To give a context, you could say that an epic is improve profile management, or improve login management, or improve onboarding. These are probably easy to say. They are epics because you can generate as many user stories under them. For example, improve onboarding process. Maybe before, the organization doesn't have a way to log in. They don't have a way to sign up. Maybe before, the company only has a way to log in and sign up. They don't have a way to forget password. What happens when the user doesn't remember their username? What happens if the user doesn't receive OTP? Or maybe they don't even have two-factor authentication at all. Now, you can have a user story called an epic called improve user onboarding. And then in this user onboarding, you had new user stories. Let's assume the company already has login and sign up. And in this process, they already validate your email and phone number. But for every time you log in, they want to send OTP to you to be sure that you are actually the one logging in. In this case, you have to be able to introduce another user story, that there is user wants to be feel more secure, and an OTP process has to be added. In this particular case, there's a new user story for OTP, and also if there's a need for forgetting password, probably you have forgetful clients who are probably like me, or users who are like me who forget their password regularly. Then you probably need the forget password process. Why? Because this process helps them to be able to get access to their account back when they are no longer there. Now, you could see these are two new user stories to an existing epic, which is improve user onboarding. So you could think about as many as possible scenarios depending on that. So I believe that with this, you can understand the difference between epics and user stories. So epics are more broader in scope, and usually epics are used on the management level, because your management doesn't necessarily need to know the in total, but just talk about it in brief. When you're doing strategic meetings, which probably I will talk about in the next meetings, or you're doing management meeting, these are epics. Usually are what you present and discuss about it. You tell them this is what the customer will be able to do, this is what the customer will be able to do. But when it comes to implementation, designer needs to design, developers needs to develop, then you need to break them down into user stories. Why? Because easily you could break down each user stories into tasks, and then it is easy for you to say this is done, that is done, that is done, and easily you're able to move to the market. So I know many people, you could see that I signed. Many people are probably asking the question, where exactly do user stories come from? Do I wait for my boss to come to me and say, hey, I need you to write these user stories? Or are there places where I can find it? Well, of course, There's user research. You could ask for feedback. How are you experiencing our system? I gave an example the other time. Maybe your platform only allows for sign up and login, and for some reason you forgot to add forget password, or for some weird reasons you decided not to add two-factor authentication in this day and age. In that scenario, you might have customers or users that are coming to you and say, I need to be able to forget my password. I don't want to always come to you every time to say, oh, you please reset my password for me. Or they can say, I don't know, I feel like there are too many people who knows my password. I don't want to change it, but can you add an extra layer of protection to it so that I can be the only one that have access to my account? Well, in such case, sometimes it could even be a CEO coming to you and saying, I gave my username and password to all of my staff, or maybe two or three of my staff, but I want to know when they log in. So please add a two-factor authentication. I mean, you have to get this feedback. Every time you speak with a customer, you always get something you can improve on. Well, when you get this feedback, should you work on it immediately? No. You should review, prioritize, think about it. There are a lot of feedback you would get. You probably won't be able to have enough resources. When I say resources, I mean designers, engineers. They might be busy with other things. So you might not be able to work on it immediately. In a later video, I will talk about the backlog management. But basically, there is a tool that we call backlog, or a concept where you're able to put in all these requests. You can consider it as a bucket or as a wardrobe where you put all the clothes that you have, or you might wear, or you might want to wear later in the future. And when you are ready for it, you remove them. Maybe that analogy doesn't really fit it well, but the point is, the backlog is a bucket of all the things that you might need to do in the future. So get this feedback from the customer a very good way. That is one of the places where you get these user stories from. You're able to generate them from the feedback that you get from the customer. Another place is the backlog itself. Remember I said, when you get the feedback from the customer, you take it to the backlog. The backlog itself is a home for many user stories. Sometimes some of them die in the backlog because you never find time to do them. However, sometimes when it's actually time to do them, you find other user stories based on several feedback that can be meshed into one. In such scenarios, you have given birth to another user stories. What do I mean? The user needs of A, B, C, and D might actually give birth to another central user need that can actually solve their problem. Another way that you can actually generate user stories are from epics. For example, let's assume your boss comes to you and say, yeah, we need to do this, we need to do that. For example, it's an internal system, and your boss, who happens to be a user of the system, is saying, I need to be able to see this dashboard. In that particular regard, while you're thinking about it, you might be able to come up with as many user stories as possible. Well, the final way that I think I know is, in some ways, you might actually get it from your competitors. One of the key responsibility of a product manager is not just to build or think of ideas, it's also to check and be sure of what the competitions are doing. Let me give an example. If you're working with a partner integration system, you need to be sure or be aware of what the partner is doing per time. And in some case, you might miss the newsletter. You might miss the newsletter that the new product by Meta allows you to send limited time offer or carousel messages. In this particular scenario, how else can you get to know about this? It's when you hear the internal gist of your team or of your competitors. You hear what is selling on their end. Then you can improve your particular offering sometimes based on that, especially if the visions align. Now, with this, I hope that you understand where user stories can be born from. How can you get inspired to write a user story? What would lead to what to get a user story done? Okay, so let's start. This is a board. On this board, I'm assuming that there's a company called Clastistic who has a board called Classistics as well within the organization. As I explained, there are quite um, a number of platforms that could be used for this to document your user stories. Some organization even use Google Sheets. Some uses Asana, ClickUp, whichever one works for your organization. But usually, like I said, the interface would most likely always be the same or similar. In this case, I'm using a free trial version, and you could see we are on the board view. There is a table view, there's a calendar view, there's a timeline view, which oftentimes is called the Gantt chart, and there's a dashboard, there's a map view, depending on your use case, basically. For the board view, we'll stick to the board view right now, but basically the same thing will be seen just with different views. For the purpose of this class, I have created on the board. This is usually called a Kanban board. Kanban board is usually a board that shows progress of a particular task. Since we are looking at user stories, we could as well look at user stories as a task. So every user story constitutes a particular task, although in some cases it's usually not like that. A user stories can have multiple branches. It could involve the front end team, it could involve the back end team, it could involve the design team, which means you have different tasks created for all of them. In some organization, they have a single task created for all of them, and then on the board they have different formats for them. For example, they have to do, they have PM review, then they have design, then they have development, different organization. But the most common one is to do, doing, and done. And in that case, we will consider that one user story is actually takes in everything, and then we'll use that example. So we would use this and say you can create a new card is basically a new task, and then in the task you can create the user story. Just to make it easy for us, I had created a template to remind us what we've discussed earlier. Every user story has a title. In this case, we can say, let's assume this user story is privacy or delete my profile. Delete my profile. Let's assume a customer has requested, or multiple customers have requested that they need a functionality to be able to delete their accounts so that you don't have their data when they're no longer working with you. And I've said earlier, every user story in its own has three major things that should be there. The first one is who is the user, the type of user. The second one is what action does the user want to perform. And then the third one is what is the benefit of this particular action to this user. In this case of delete profile, I have copied an example that we can just use easily, and then we'll write the acceptance criteria together. As you can see, as a privacy conscious user, I want to delete my profile so that my personal data is permanently removed from the system. The acceptance criteria we have here is actually in two ways. Like I said, you could have a scenario-based acceptance criteria, or you can have a rule-based acceptance criteria. In the case of this user story, the base would be given that I have an account on the platform. Then when I click the button to delete my profile, then all information the company has about me should be deleted. So in this example, like I said the other time, two ways you can write acceptance criteria. The first way is scenario based. That means you are creating an image on the mind of the person that is working on the task of what outcome you expect the user to have. So you are creating the image as the user that will use the app. But like I said earlier, this sometimes can be very bulky. Imagine you have minimum of 5-6 things to validate on a particular user story. You could have a documentation bulkier than the previous method of writing user story. Remember, one of the goals of coming to user stories is to actually be able to reduce the documentation. Why I like rule-oriented approach is because a single action button can actually give you what you need with the scenario approach. For example, confirm that when I click on the delete button, the system deletes all my data from the system, from the company's database, for example. Now, this is more easy, in a way, less bulky than this scenario oriented. So if you're one, by the way, this that I've written now can also be written even in a shorter way. So if you are someone that prefer to use result oriented checklist, then this is your cue. If you are someone that prefers to use scenario oriented, any one of the two can actually work. But for rule oriented one, you have to always define everything. For example, this is not the only thing you define for this user story. You want to define other things. For example, confirm that before a customer could access the delete button, they have an active account. For example, you might want to confirm this. You might want to confirm that before the delete process is initiated, send a show a modal to the customer confirming if they really want to delete, and the implication, for example, of their action. Now, these are actions checklists that actually support the same user stories. So these are all acceptance criteria for them. So this in its way helps the designer know, oh, I have to do this, I have to add this, I have to add this. And at the end of the day, they're able to actually get value for what they are doing. I hope at the end of the day, you've been able to gain one or two things from this. Usually, acceptance criteria and user stories could also be separated. You could add it as a checklist as well. For example, you could add this, confirm, as a checklist under the acceptance criteria, so that as opposed to them reading this, they can see a checklist, and every time they are done with one, they can move it to done. Well, we've come to the end of this training, and I really hope that you've learned one or two things. If you do have questions regarding user stories, Epic, or anything at all, or what you want me to discuss in the next video, please drop the comment here, and I will be available to support you. See you in the next one. My name remains Oluyomi Olushola Michael, the products manager. My name remains Oluyomi Olushola My name remains Oluyomi Olushola Michael, your favorite product manager. See you on the next one. Bye.